welcome. This is Caitlin from PhotoShelter's marketing team. I have Darina Kopcok, obviously, who is here with us to talk about food photography composition. And then Jeremy, who is the master of all social media, is here with us as well. So hello to everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
Just so everybody knows, this will be recorded and will be available on our blog as well as sent out via email. So, feel free to take notes, but you certainly will have that opportunity, to view it on demand if you need to. So just to introduce Darina here, she is obviously a really incredible photographer. She's also a writer and educator based in Vancouver, Canada. She specializes in food, still life, and editorial photography, and she has been a PhotoShelter member since 2015. So we are thrilled to have her be a part of, our webinar series, and she's got some really great info for everybody here. So Darina, I'm going to hand it over to you, and you should be able to go through your slides whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here, and thanks for that great introduction. So Caitlin, when you approached me about food photography, you left it up to me as what I'd be speaking about. And the reason I chose food photography composition is that it's something that I find that a lot of people struggle with, even when they've been shooting food for a while, but there's not as much information out there about it as the technical aspects of photography, for example. So I wanted to just go over today some of the basic principles that you find in food photography composition, but it's really only going to skim the surface. There really is so much to composition. So I hope that some of you will get some great tips out of this, but just keep in mind that it's quite a large topic. So hopefully you'll get some good takeaways from it, and you might want to explore it a little further.
Absolutely. And you should be able to go through, Darina, but let me know if you are having any trouble.
Okay, yeah, it's not going through.
Okay, bear with me 1 second. Try now.
All right. Okay, there we go. Okay, so before I get into talking about some of these compositional principles, I just want to talk about why the composition is important. So composition obviously is important in every type of photography, but food photography is a type of still life photography. And in still life photography, it's almost like there is more of a focus on composition. And the focus also really has to be on food. Food is the star. We call it the hero of our image. And it's meant to evoke the emotions and stir the senses. So with our composition, we really want to bring people into that experience and interacting with the image. Now, compositional principles, you sometimes hear about them being talked about as rules, but they're not really rules. They're these time-tested guidelines, and they don't always work perfectly for every image. So you can have a variety of different tools at your disposal in terms of these guidelines, but not every single one will work perfectly for every image every time. So that's one thing that you want to keep in mind when you're working with composition. And another thing to also realize is that it's really an intuitive process. It's kind of subconscious on some levels. You know, these days we're really bombarded with a lot of imagery. We have, Instagram and, social media and the internet, and we have a lot of imagery coming at us every day. And through that process of interacting with those images, that we develop this kind of visual literacy. So when we're composing our food photography or photography in general, we're kind of looking at it in terms of what looks good and doing it quite successfully a lot of the time without really understanding sometimes even what are the compositional principles that we're using. And even if we do know some of these compositional principles, for example, rule of thirds is one that a lot of people are familiar with. You can be composing an image with a rule of thirds in mind, but there's also going to be a variety of other patterns and symmetries that are emerging within that frame instinctively without you even realizing it. And one of the things that I wanted to also mention to people, because I find that when I work with a lot of photographers that are in the beginning stages, they're not shooting tethered. So this is one thing that I just wanted to mention before I continue, because this is something that I feel really, really helps people elevate their composition very quickly when they start using it. So if you have a laptop, hooking up your camera to the laptop and using a program like Lightroom, or you can use your proprietary software that comes with your computer, and just getting that larger rendition of the image onto the screen is really, really going to help you with your composition and helping you notice things that you might not have noticed if you were just looking at the back of your LCD screen. And also, before I get into these compositional patterns, I want to also mention how we read an image, and also how to start improving your composition without just looking at those patterns on their own. And one of these ways is that I recommend that photographers study other photographers and study their work. So not just the food photography or food photographers whose works they really gravitate to, but also other photographers that are known to be, the great photographers in various genres, like, Henri Cartier-Bresson is very well known for his composition. So studying photography and looking at it, engaging with those images, trying to understand why they work, why they're being composed the way they are, and then also studying art. So paintings, like the old masters, they did a lot of still life, and really trying to understand the lighting and the composition, and how they achieved what they achieved in those images that have stood the test of time. And the other thing that I also encourage people to do is to study color theory, because a lot of people don't realize that color is a really important compositional tool. And it's one of the things that I'm going to talk a little bit more about later. So how do we read an image? So it really depends on our culture and how we typically read in general when we're reading a book. So in English, in the Western world, we read from left to right, whereas some other cultures, and they might be reading from right to left. So this is something that a lot of people also don't realize, but it's going to affect the way that you interpret an image and the way you compose an image, depending on the market that you're working in or you're shooting in. So when we're reading from left to right, we're basically looking at an image the same way. So the eye moves towards the greatest point of interest, which is usually our subject or our food subject, or what we call our hero. And then there are other elements in the frame that have visual weight that are going to vie for our attention. So if we look at this image that I have on the screen here, we have our subject, which is the apple cake. The pattern in here is a little bit more of like the curved lines and the flow of the napkin, but then we have some diagonal line with the knife, and we have the spoon and the caramel sauce. So the apple cake is the subject, and the other elements are the props, but they all have visual weight, and that means that they basically take up space in the image. And the visual weight is most important to have like the heaviest visual weight on the subject, but the other items are also going to give some weight. And also what you might notice in this image in the bottom is we have quite a bit of negative space, and negative space is also considered an element in photography. So it has some visual weight as well. And I'll be talking a little bit more about negative space as we go through the slides too. So the important thing to remember when we are composing is that you don't want to have too much going on in an image. So photographers have their different styles. Some have a little bit more of a minimalistic style. Some like to have a lot of elements and prop and more, you know, a real sense of like visual storytelling in their image. But composition will still help you achieve a certain effect, even if you have a lot of things, if you do it correctly. It's just important to not have too much going on in an image, because if you have a lot of items and you don't have a negative space and you're not creating that flow, then what happens is that the viewer can end up being unsure of where to look. And then that almost gives a sense of like overwhelm and, you know, claustrophobia. So fundamentally, leading lines and tension are what are going to keep the eye interested in what's going on in the frame. So an example of tension in this image would just be the spoon at the top is cut off a little bit, the prop on the side is cut off a little bit, and that just keeps the eye from wanting to bounce out of the frame and just coming back to the subject again. So before we can get into any conversation really about those patterns, we want to think about camera angle and orientation. So this is really where your composition starts, and your choice in those are going to have a big impact on the placement of your items. So in food photography, the main angles are over. Then we have a 3/4 shot, and can be anywhere between 25 to 75 degrees. And then we basically have our eye level shot. So your subject will usually dictate the angle that you choose. So for example, in my image, in the sandwich here, I really wanted to show the layers. There's the ham and the onion, the lettuce and tomatoes. That's what I'm trying to basically sell in this image. So you want the viewer to see the layers. So I chose an angle, not quite straight on, it's more like a 25 degrees. So you can see a little bit of the texture of the top of the bun as well. So this is what would be considered a tall food. So tall foods like burgers and pancakes, you probably would choose something closer to eye level so you can see the layers. But with something like a pizza, you typically would want to see the toppings, unless it was more of like a cheese pull shot, that kind of thing. So then an overhead 90-degree shot would be a good choice, right? So you want to think about that the height and the camera angle, and then as far as the orientation, are you going to be shooting in portrait or are you going to be shooting in landscape? That's also going to dictate your composition, right? Because you can't just go from portrait to landscape without having to recompose, right? So one of the things that, you know, if I'm working for a restaurant, for example, and then they want portrait and landscape shots of one image, then I say, yeah, I can do that, that's fine, but I have to recompose. So it's going to take me twice as long to shoot that image than it ordinarily would. So that's also one of the things that you have to think about in terms of composition.
All right, and thank you so much, Darina. I actually have thought about that a lot with my at-home food photography lately, especially with my sandwiches. So I love that example that you just shared. I think Jeremy is going to probably take a question or two just from the questions box, and then we can kind of move forward. What about you, Jeremy?
Yeah. Well, first of all, loving this so far. Thanks so much, Darina.
Oh, thank you.
This might be difficult for you to choose, but here's a question for you. Do you have like a favorite type of food that you like to photograph? I know you were talking about like high angle versus, you know, eye level, but do you have a favorite type of food that you prefer to photograph?
Yes, absolutely. I would say that my favorite foods to photograph are generally in the produce kind of realm. So pomegranates, because they have such beautiful color and texture, artichokes, really, yeah, I would say anything in the produce, and I do that quite a bit. And it's something that I actually recommend that food photographers, especially if they're quite new and they want to practice lighting and composition, they're a great subject to get started with because they have so much inherent natural texture and beauty, and they don't die quickly on set, right? So you can, chop them up and move them around and play with them for quite a while, and they're not going to start to, go off and necessarily look brown after 10 minutes. So yeah, so when I have a chance, especially now, I'm really looking forward to summer coming up and all the stone fruit and so forth, and shooting more of those.
For sure.
I love that. We used to work right by the Union Square Farmers Market, so I will second
lucky.
the ability to just be able to shoot fresh produce, and to our advantage. Unfortunately, we didn't actually buy all of it, so not sure the farmers necessarily love that, but I do completely second that, Darina. I think that it's really great, especially the stone fruit in the summer.
Yeah. We have one more question here before we continue. And maybe this varies with the type of shot as well, but Chelsea asks, what aperture do you recommend for food?
Oh, that's a great question, because I notice a lot of struggles with this. So if you're shooting other types of photography, or you're coming from other genres like portraiture, it's very common to shoot very wide open. But in food photography, I recommend that in the most part that people start at least at f5.6. And the reason for that is if you go much lower than that, and of course, I'm not saying that it's a hard and fast rule and you can't go lower. It really depends on what you're shooting and how close you are to the shot and so forth, what lens you're using. But in general, if you go much less than that, you're not going to get enough of the subject in focus. And if you're shooting overhead, you need to be at 5.6 at a very minimum, else your image is going to look blurry. And if you're using a macro lens, then you probably need to go a little bit higher and start maybe like at f8 or higher.
Good to know. Good to know. Feel free to continue. We'll take more questions definitely down the line.
Okay, so now I'm kind of get more into some of those patterns or principles of composition. So some of these will include the rule of odds, which a lot of people might be familiar with. Maybe a little bit less familiar with the golden triangle, composing in triangles. And then, of course, one of the basics and my favorite is diagonal lines. So lines and shapes are the basic elements of composition. So even if you're doing a very minimalistic composition, you're going to have some sort of lines and shapes throughout it. And the lines can be real lines, or they can actually be, imaginary lines that are leading the eye to key focal points and elements within the frame, right? So in this image here, I have diagonal lines, but I also have other symmetries emerging here. So basically I have the rule of odds. I've also composed in a triangle. So this is an example of how you can have different patterns in one image and have basically different principles, even in something that is quite minimalistic. So we have diagonal lines in image, we have horizontal lines, and we have vertical lines. And lines basically give a sense of movement, but different lines have a different energy to them. So if you have a horizontal line, for example, if you're shooting in a landscape orientation and then you have kind of a line going horizontally through your frame, that's going to give quite a bit of a calmness to the frame. Whereas if you have it more of a vertical line up and down, it's going to have this sort of like energy of strength. And then the diagonal lines, which probably I would say are the most common, they're going to give a lot more energy and be more dynamic. And as I go through some of these slides, I can give you a couple of examples and point out a few of these. And so the other thing to also keep in mind is shape. Shape is something that's immediately processed by our brains when we look at a picture. So you want to be also careful about the shapes that you have in an image and how many you have in an image, right? So an example of this would be, one of the things that I'm really looking forward to right now is that it's tomato season and I want to shoot a bunch of tomatoes and I want to get heirloom and different types and shoot them together. And that's going to be an attractive picture because there's going to be different shapes of those tomatoes. And I think that makes more of a powerful image sometimes than just choosing one type of tomato because it's going to have all the same shape. So it's really a combination of shapes that can be most appealing. So shape helps us interpret an image, and this kind of, the second point here just touches on what I was saying, is that images are most pleasing when we can integrate different sizes and shapes in our food styling and propping. So it's not just our food that, food naturally has a shape and that's what we're playing with, but props will also have a shape and they're going to be interacting with that food. But you can have too much of a good thing. So you want to make sure that you don't have, too many shapes, too many squares and rectangles and circles and too much going on in one image, because that's going to create a sense of competition and overwhelm the viewer. Okay, so those basics, that's where you want to start, is the very basic, thinking about leading lines and thinking about shapes. But then there are compositional patterns that we commonly use in food photography. So the first one is rule of thirds. And I think probably a lot of people are quite familiar with rule of thirds. It's one of the first patterns that you learn about when you start learning about composition. And this is where the frame is divided into 9 equal parts, and the lines where the lines where they meet is where we place a focal point. So we want to have one part of that image that draws the eye, and we call that a focal point. And then we have 3 patterns: Phi-Grid, Golden Triangle, and Fibonacci Spiral, and they are all expressions of something that is called the golden mean. It's also known as the golden ratio and the divine proportion, and I think there's probably a couple of other names for it, and I'll just go over a little bit more about what that is. But I do want to mention before I get into that about the rule of thirds is that it can work like exceptionally well for landscape photography, for example, most of the time, but in food photography, it can be a little bit limiting. So one of the things that I encourage people who are working with the rule of thirds, if they want to have the same type of composition, is to bring those lines in the middle a bit closer and having the, of course, keeping a focal point, but just changing it up a little bit. And the Phi-Grid is an expression of this ratio. So in the rule of thirds, we said that it was 1, 1, 1. The golden ratio is 1, 1, 6, 1, 8. And this is actually a mathematical ratio, and I'm not like a big math person, so I can't really explain exactly what it is, but if you're interested in finding more about it, there's lots on the internet, and especially getting into the mathematics of it all, it's something that has been studied for basically thousands of years. And the reason for that is that it's a phenomenon that's found in nature. So this ratio is said to be found in everything from the solar system to a nautilus shell to a flower, and even in the proportions of the human body. So if that's something that interests you, there is plenty of information to dive into on the internet. But for our purposes, it's just that you need to understand that there is a mathematical ratio, and this is where these patterns come from. And the reason it's important in photography is that our brain recognizes it as aesthetically attractive and harmonious, probably because it is a constant in our world and it's around us and we're just used to seeing it. So again, the focal point must fall in one of the areas where the lines intersect. It doesn't have to be exact, but you do want it generally in that area. So in this image that I have of the mushrooms, actually my little red dot there kind of covers up my focal point. But what I did is I lit one of the pieces of mushroom to really catch the light, and that's how I created a focal point. So the focal point can be naturally occurring in the food, or you can place a garnish in the focal point. You can create a break in a pattern, for example, or use a different color. So there's different ways that you can actually have a focal point in an image. Okay, so this is an example of a comparison of the rule of thirds and the Phi-Grid. So if you look at the image of the donuts on the left, it has been cropped using a rule of thirds grid, and the image on the right has been cropped using the Phi-Grid. So there's not a lot of difference between them, but you'll notice that the donuts in the rule of third, they're both cut off from the edge, whereas with the Phi-Grid, there's a little bit of breathing room on the left-hand side for the donut. So it allows for a little bit better movement and flow. And I feel like with the rule of thirds, it wasn't quite working, because to me, it feels almost like a little bit claustrophobic. So if you are interested in experimenting with this and you use Lightroom or some other proprietary software, they do have crop overlays with these patterns that you can put on top of your image, and you can test them out, and you can try different crops and see which one fits best. And I think that's also a really good way to learn, is to use those overlays while you're shooting as well. And then that whole composition process becomes more and more instinctive the more experience you have in shooting. Okay, the golden triangle is also has this ratio, and it divides the frame into triangles, as you see in the overlay I have in the image here. And these are a really dynamic way to compose food photography. So if you start to study food photography, you'll see that a lot of food photographers are using this. So again, using the diagonals, because diagonals, have a lot of energy to them. But also using this to create movement is a really good way to compose, for example, like a flat lay like we have here, and having that sort of like the eye going through the frame and keeping interest in those elements. So the points of interest are where these lines meet. So that's where you want to place your important elements. And again, one of the things that I wanted to mention about so I just mentioned those overlays in Lightroom. It's a good idea when you're starting to use some of these patterns, if you don't have a lot of experience in them, but you want to try them out, is to shoot your image more loosely than you ordinarily would, and then go into Lightroom and use these as a guide in cropping the image to what you want. This is something that I do quite often myself, is just I try to use my eye, but when I get it into, my software program that I'm using, like Lightroom, is I crop it down so it fits a little bit better. So that's just one tip that I find really makes a big difference. Okay, and then we have the Fibonacci spiral. So again, Fibonacci was a mathematician in the Renaissance, and again, there's lots of information on the internet that you can find out about this mathematical equation if you're interested in that sort of thing. But it's basically used to draw a series of squares going from really small to large, and it creates this kind of arc and a sense of like flow and movement in the frame. So it's more in terms of like when you're using curved lines instead of diagonal or more like dynamic lines. The important thing with using this pattern, again, is that you have a focal point that's generally falling in the smallest area. So you could flip the spiral. It doesn't matter if you have it in landscape or portrait. You can, use it whichever way you want, as long as you aim to have the focal point generally in that smaller area. So this is a pattern that works really well for overhead shots. It helps you keep flat lays from looking too cluttered or disjointed, and just really works well to guide the eye gently throughout the image. Okay, so now we're getting to one of my favorites, which is the rule of odds. The rule of odds is really simple to use, but it makes such a big difference in an image. So the rule of odds is basically the idea that odd numbers actually give a sense of balance and harmony to an image, while even numbers tend to divide and compete with each other for the eye's attention. The thing that you have to realize about the rule of odds, however, is that our brain has trouble processing more than 5 items at once. So if you have several items that you want to compose in your frame, then it's a good idea to compose them in smaller groups, and some of these smaller groups being odds as well. So if you look at the image that I have here, I have my 3 eggs, and then I have 5 items here, which is an odd number. And I have the dry ingredients, 3 of those, and then the butter and the milk here. And composing it this way makes the image a lot more dynamic, creates a sense of flow, doesn't divide the attention, and it also gives quite a bit of negative space. So we have quite a bit of what we call negative space, which is that blank space in more of like the top left side. And negative space is really important in an image because it gives us breathing room and a moment for the eye to rest, an area for the eye to rest. And it really portrays movement, helps portray movement and bring context to an image. And also what negative space tends to do is it can give you this idea that there's a larger story taking place beyond the frame. So even in a simple composition, what you're trying to do is you're trying to create some kind of like visual story to really invite the person in. And negative space is one of the ways that we can do that. And it's also important to mention is if you're doing a lot of types of photography, editorial photography, food packaging, you might actually be directed by your client to have a lot of negative space because there needs to be this blank space for text or type. Food packaging in particular, they want to have the name of the product and it can't be touching the picture that will actually be on the packaging. Okay, and repetition and pattern, they're also an important compositional principles. So in our natural world, we're surrounded by pattern. Pattern is basically a repetition of any kind of graphical element. And it's something that I think that we don't even notice because there's just so much of it in nature and around us. But in an image, it provides a visual rhythm. So this repetition can occur spontaneously or be created. So it could be, usually it's more your placement, how you place things can create repetition. For example, if you have several brownies, you might want to place them all horizontally or vertically, or you might want to place them on diagonals. There's different ways to use those lines, but you're still creating a repetition because you have the same subject that is appearing throughout the frame. So in my image here, I have several biscotti and created that repeating pattern with it. But one of the things that I was careful to do was I tried to keep it quite consistent, but also not too perfect, because then that might have ended up looking a little bit monotonous. And patterns can tend to be a little bit monotonous anyway, so it's important to try to break them up a little bit, and that's going to create a more dynamic photo. So one of the things that I was conscious of in this image was actually the pistachios and how the pistachios were looking, because those were creating a break in that repetition because they were a little bit different. They're on diagonal, they're not facing the same way. So that's creating a little bit more of that, that tension in the image. So generally you want to create some sort of break in an image that has a lot of repetition, and probably the best way to do that is to actually place a break along one of the focal points if you can. And how you create a break is you can do that with color, you can do it with shape, you can do it with size, and you can do it with texture.
I love that. Thank you so much, Darina. Those are great examples, especially just to let everybody know we are recording this. So do keep in mind that if you know, you wanted to take any notes, any things like that, we certainly, you know, you'll have access to that later on. And Jeremy, I was wondering if we've gotten any questions before Darina jumps into color theory.
Yes, we can take one question just so we can jump back in it before the dedicated Q&A. But we've gotten a couple people ask Darina if you use your own food stylist, and if you could talk a little bit about that.
Okay, so it really depends on the project that I'm working on and the client. So if it's a small client and it's like a very basic food product, then quite often I do the styling. But in general, for most commercial projects, I do work with a food stylist because food styling it's such a different skill set, and you know, some people are better at it than others. You know, some photographers really enjoy food styling, and other photographers not so much. But the main key to remember about food styling, and if you are working with a client, is that it's really going to take you twice as long to do anything. So if you're trying to light the scene and take care of the photography end of it, but then you're also trying to, you know, prepare and plate stuff, it's going to take you a lot longer. And this is one of the things that I explain to my clients in the beginning, because most of them, especially if they haven't worked with a food photographer before, they always ask me if I do the styling, and I explain that really it's a lot more cost effective actually for them to hire a food stylist instead of paying me and my day rate and what it costs for me to be on set, because it's going to take me twice as long to accomplish it. So when I explain that to them and kind of show them the numbers, then they understand that, yeah, actually it doesn't save them money like they think it's going to. It's going to probably cost them more money because I'm going to be able to maybe only shoot 5 or 6 images instead of 10 images.
Good to know. Darina, we have a lot of great questions, but I'm going to hold off just so we can finish your presentation and then do a little dedicated Q&A. So feel free to continue, and I have some questions jotted down here for the Q&A part in just a little bit.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to take a moment to touch on color theory, because as I mentioned, it's a really important part of composition. And I also mentioned that composition is quite a vast subject, and color theory is also quite a vast subject. So there's a lot more that you can learn, but I just wanted to give you a few tips about the things that will immediately start to help you in your food photography composition. So the reason that color is so important is that it evokes emotion, right? We have an associate, like, you know, red can mean anger, or red we associate with love, that kind of thing. So it really creates this sense of mood in an image, and really goes a long way in creating that sort of emotional connection that we want the photo to have with our viewer. So before you can really get into the actual color, you want to think about, you know, are the colors light or dark? Are they warm or are they cool, right? So cool colors are more on that kind of, you know, blue bottom side of the color wheel. And then the warmer colors, of course, are more like the, you know, the yellow and, you know, orange colors. So when you have cool colors or you have dark colors, basically they recede, right? So that means they kind of go back, whereas light or warm colors bring objects forward, right? So one example of this is in terms of clothing, right? So if you wear an outfit that's all black, as opposed to wearing an outfit that's all white, you're going to tend to look slimmer in the black outfit because that dark color is receding and making the body shape look smaller, while white tends to have that opposite effect. So when it comes to choosing color, and again, I have a picture of the color wheel here because this is a good way to get started, but it's also very limiting if you're just looking at the color wheel itself, because there can be so many tones and hues and variations in color. So this is something that I urge photographers to look into a little bit more deeply if they're interested in that. But for our purposes today, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about, you know, what colors are a good idea to choose in food photography. So in general, I recommend sticking to neutral tones for backdrops. So white, black, variations on gray, brown if it's like a deep kind of espresso brown or neutral brown, and then also different varieties of blue, because blue really is a nice complement to food. If you look at most food, you know, not greens and produce and, you know, some of those things, but a lot of food, especially cooked food, is warm in color. So when you have that on a blue background, then you're going to have a balance of warm and cool colors, and it's going to look more dynamic. And that blue color is going to give the image a sense of like freshness and crispness. One of the things that you might notice sometimes is some woods that look quite orange, and this is probably a bit more of my opinion, but I think it tends to look unappealing with food. To me, it's almost, you know, you have the warm food and then you have like the orangey kind of woods, and the whole image feels quite warm, and that almost, it gives me a little bit more of a dated sort of feeling, like food photography used to look like, say, in the 80s or the 90s. So a more modern approach is using more, like, you know, the neutral colors with the food, or the blues with the food. So if you notice in my food photography in particular, I'm using either monochromatic tones or generally a lot of the kind of like blue and, you know, orange, like the warm with the blue. So if you look at the color wheel, the colors that are the colors that opposite blue are like the orangey tones. So this is an example of a complementary color. Complementary are colors that are opposite to each other on the color wheel. And then we have red and green that are opposite, and then we have like purple and yellow that are opposite. So the blue and the orange, those kind of tones, I think is a really strong approach, and it works a lot of time for different food subjects. A single hue with tonal variations, these are what are called monochromatic, and I tend to do monochromatic sometimes. I used to do it a lot more than I do now. When I was a little bit less confident about my colors. So for example, you know, you have a loaf of bread or banana bread, you know, this basically brown food, and then you have it on like a brown wooden cutting board and maybe a brown rustic kind of picnic table background. That would be considered a monochromatic kind of shot. So another thing that's important to remember about color is that when you are working with different colors, that they should be balanced throughout the frame. So if you are shooting a bunch of, you know, oranges, say blood oranges and regular oranges would be a good example, because they have different tones of that orange, that you balance those colors throughout the frame, and that one color isn't all appearing in one group and another color isn't appearing in another group. Okay. Proportion and scale, this is also something that I wanted to mention. So everything that I've been really talking about comes down to the relationship, basically, of the different elements that you have in your composition and how they're interacting with each other. And scale is an important part of this. And this is something that I noticed that beginners especially tend to make quite a lot of mistakes with scale. So scale refers to the size of an object in relation to another object on the set or in the composition, while proportion refers to relative size of parts within a whole. So an example of proportion would be the human body. So there's the proportion of the head and the arms, and we expect to see, you know, certain proportions of those parts to look a certain way. So the point about scale is that some objects can look really large to the camera and then end up pulling away the attention from the subject. And you always want that attention on your subject, or what we call the hero. So that's one thing that you have to be really careful of when you're choosing props. So in this picture here, I have a pie. It's a standard 9-inch pie, so it's not a small pie, but I had to be really careful in choosing the props to go with this, because I wanted to, you know, fill out that background and, you know, to have this story going on in the frame, but I still wanted that attention to be on the pie. So if you look at those plates in the background, they're actually quite small plates, but if you look at them in terms of the relationship between that plate and the pie plate, they don't actually look like that much smaller, but they are quite a bit smaller. The camera just tends to exaggerate those sides of the props. And then as far as the creamer and the sugar bowl, I had to, again, like find something small so it wasn't calling too much attention to the props, and that they weren't too high and taking up, you know, too much of the image. So basically, if you are using scale incorrectly, your image can end up looking unbalanced and you know, unrealistic, right? I find this in overhead shots, especially. You can have like a small pinch bowl in an overhead shot, but because it flattens depth, it can end up like looking really large in proportion to your main subject or your food. So you just want to make sure that when you're especially in an overlay shot, that everything looks like the proper proportion in relationship to each other. So one of my tips is to shop around for small props in places like vintage store, secondhand store, that kind of thing, especially glassware. Glassware these days tends to be a lot larger than it used to be. And it's better if you tend to have quite small glassware in your shots. So also salad plates. Salad plates are more often used than dinner plates, because a lot of times you can't even really tell how large that plate is in, you know, unless it's in relationship to other things that are on the set. So just one thing to be really careful about is watching the scale and what are those sizes of your props in comparison to your main subject. And the main subject always wants to have the most attention. Okay, so the last thing that I wanted to talk about was just like a little tip about getting started with composition and going into your next shoot, and that is the process of pre-visualization. Okay, so when you're working with clients will typically have some sort of creative direction for you in terms of a creative brief or mock-ups, and the purpose of that is to define the vision and creative direction, not only for you, but for, you know, everybody that is involved in pulling off this, you know, campaign or shoot or whatever. It might involve, you know, mood boards from Pinterest and that kind of thing, because just telling you what they're looking for is not necessarily going to give you a very clear idea of what they're looking for. So this is a tool that is used very often with agencies and more experienced clients, but it's also something that you could use yourself when you're shooting for your portfolio, or you're shooting for your blog or Instagram, that kind of thing, is to go through a pre-visualization process. And that means having a vision and plan for your image before you pick up the camera. And this is going to save you a lot of time and improve your results in the end, because you're not just kind of experimenting as you go along, basically. And I found that when I was first starting shooting photography, that I really enjoyed that kind of experimentation process and liked learning through that process. But as I got, you know, more experienced and I was working with clients, I started to actually draw things out and really kind of think about the lighting that I wanted to use, what props I would use in background, and basically just sketching it out. Because I find now that if I don't, that I end up having redundant compositions. I tend to gravitate to the same 2 or 3 different ways of composing my shots without really thinking about it too much. So this is an example, this image. This is a sketch that I did of when I was thinking of shooting this stake shot. It's just been digitized, so it looks a lot better than what I drew. But it just, very simple. But I went into this shoot thinking, okay, well, I have steak. It's not very, raw meat, not very attractive to shoot. How can I make this look better? And I really wanted to kind of have sort of like a steakhouse feel. So I chose, darker and moodier lighting, garnish the steak just to make it look better. Thought about, the shape and the line and so forth that I wanted to have, color and overall mood. And then this was the result, just coming from a drawing. Okay, thank you. I could talk about composition for hours, but I guess that's all we have time for today. And like to have some time for questions as well. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Darina. That was really, really special. I really love the pre-visualization tips. I feel like that's such an easy way for you to look really professional to clients, as well as, I've definitely struggled, I think, with having the same composition, just because I think that's what I sort of naturally gravitate towards. So I really appreciate that advice.
Yeah. Yeah, because it worked in the past, so it's going to keep working, right? And then you just tend to, I know that for myself as well.
Exactly. And then your portfolio looks quite, one directional, I would say. Great. So we're going to take a few questions. Jeremy has been keeping a close eye on that questions box. So we'll take a few questions from everybody. And then, unfortunately, we're never able to get to everyone's questions. So if anybody has any follow-up questions, feel free to tweet them at us and we can, hopefully get those answered a little bit later. But take it away, Jeremy.
Great. So we have a bunch of awesome questions about lighting. So Darina, do you mind talking about your lighting? Do you prefer artificial or natural light? How do you go about lighting your photos most of the time?
Okay, so when I first started photography, definitely used natural light. For many years I was learning, and I think it's really important for people to start there. Once you learn natural light, then you can go on to artificial light and you understand the principles. So it's really just a matter of getting the technical part of the lighting down, but you do understand how light works. I would say that I use artificial light 95% of the time, and the reason for that is it's basically what's expected based on the type of commercial work that I do. Natural light is really good for editorial photography, but sometimes not always the best for certain commercial photography, because the light is very produced and it looks produced, really depending on what you're doing. But also, even when I'm shooting at home for myself in my home studio and I could use natural window light, I do tend to prefer artificial light, just because I feel that I'm used to it and I have a greater sense of control over my lighting in general. And I've developed a certain lighting style in my images that I like to be consistent throughout most of my work, even if it's something that I'm doing for my portfolio.
Great tips. For those of you who have to jump out at 1, I just want to reiterate that 1, this will be recorded, so we'll definitely release the recording. And 2, for anyone who can stick around, we're going to go just a little bit past 1 to take more questions. So feel free to, continue submitting questions and stick around for, some more answers from Darina. Here's another question for you, Darina. We have a lot of people asking about lenses and lens recommendations and like lenses and tripods. So if you have any recommendations for those, we'd love to hear them.
Okay. Well, as far as lenses, I think if you have a couple of lenses in your kit, that will probably serve you most of the time. The lens you choose really does depend on whether you have a cropped sensor in your camera or you have a full frame, right? Because they're not always interchangeable. And because of the crop factor in a cropped sensor, you're going to actually end up with images that look a lot more cropped in for that focal length than they would on another camera, right? So I use a full frame camera. I use a Canon 5D, and the lenses that I use most often for that would be 100mm macro, and I really love to use it not only for macro shots, but if you step a bit of a distance away from your set, you can actually get like really nice food portraits. And in that case, you're not actually using the macro capabilities of the lens. So it's kind of like having a 2-in-1. So I think that if I were only able to have one lens in my kit, that would probably be the one. But I also have a 24-70, so that's a zoom lens. I have the Canon L series 24-70 zoom lens, so I find that it's actually really sharp considering it is a zoom lens, because prime lenses are usually preferable for food photography because you do just get such sharpness out of it. Zoom lenses have a lot of moving parts, and then that kind of reduces the quality of the sharpness. But I find that lens really, really good in terms of the sharpness, and I use that a lot for flat lays, or to go to, like, say, more of maybe kind of use it at like 60, 65, I think is good for portrait. And then of course I can, sometimes do the wide angle shots that I need to. And then as for a cropped sensor, if you do have a cropped sensor of your camera, I think the 50, they call it the nifty 50 because it's not very expensive and it's great for a lot of shots, and especially flat lays. And then I would also probably suggest like a 60mm macro for a cropped one as well. And then if you do upgrade to a full frame, you can use it very much like you would use a 50mm.
Great. Just to continue there, do you have any recommendations or tips about tripods? Do you typically use a tripod for your work?
I always use a tripod. I have I think it's a Manfrotto 190. I really like the Manfrotto line of tripods. I think it's important to get quite a sturdy tripod. So if you're looking at something that costs like less than $300, it's probably not going to do the trick for you, because the tripod has to be able to withstand the weight of your lens, your camera, a speed light. If you use a speed light, maybe you're going to be using it on with an extension arm. So yeah, I would definitely invest in a better tripod, and then when you have that, you have it for many years. So payload is really important, and also that that has rubber feet, so there's no slippage, and that you have like a column. Well, you can get an extension arm, or you can get a tripod that actually has an extension, so you can do overlay shots. And if you are using that, you just want to make sure that you counteract the weight of your camera with a sandbag or some kind of weight on it, so it doesn't topple over.
Yes, good to know. Great tips. Thank you, Darina. I have two fun questions before we finish up here.
Okay.
Peter asked, does your job make you hungry, and do you eat before a shoot?
That's funny, actually. Yeah, sometimes I eat, but I find when I'm shooting that I don't eat. I think I'm just kind of in work mode and have a lot of energy and so forth. But typically you are supposed to eat. You're supposed to have a lunch break. So when you're negotiating, even for a restaurant, you're negotiating your price, you want to ask them, you know, if they're going to feed you, what the expectations are around meals, because I always work with an assistant. I'm working with a food stylist. So I want to make sure they're going to be fed. So whether I'm working with a restaurant or if I'm working with a client directly, that's a conversation that I have, because that has to be a part of what is in the estimate is money for lunch, money for, you know, snacks, coffee, that kind of thing, that should be subsidized by the client.
Awesome. Here's one last question for you, Darina. And I guess it could be a two-parter before we wrap up. What is the most difficult food you've had to photograph? And I guess you touched on what your favorite is, but maybe some, like, you know, more simple foods to photograph.
Okay. So sorry, what was the worst? Was it the worst?
The most difficult. The most difficult.
Most difficult.
Yeah.
The most difficult. Well, meat, meat, especially cooked meat. I mean, generally in brown foods can be quite difficult, but you know, meat tends to be hard to shoot, and it usually involves quite a bit of trickery on the food styling part. So if I get a client who wants me to shoot meat, that's not usually something that I'm going to style myself. It's something that I'm going to hire a stylist for. And again, they have a lot of tricks up their sleeve, like undercooking the meat, using like a pastry torch on it to brown it, or, you know, a barbecue starter to put grill marks on it. They soak it in oil, you know, like burger patty, they soak it in oil to keep it fresh until it's ready on set, those kinds of things. So there are ways to work with it and make it look better, but yeah, it's hard to make it look appealing in an image for sure. And the other part, I was, sorry, the simplest, or?
Yeah, I would say like the opposite of difficult here. Like, what's the simplest foods, the easiest foods to work with, the ones that you enjoy? I know you said produce in the beginning is kind of your favorite,
Yeah, really, yeah, and also desserts. I think desserts are, you know, they're a little bit more challenging than, for example, just, you know, doing the fruit kind of thing, but they're also they look quite attractive. They have nice colors. They tend to look pretty. You can cut them and arrange them in different ways. You don't have to necessarily be a baker or bake things yourself. You can go to the bakery and buy things and, you know, cut them up and plate them and make them look nice, and create a visual story with some, you know, elements like coffee or other beverages and so forth. So I find dessert is a good one that looks nice in the portfolio, but it's fun to practice with, and a little simpler as well than some other items.
I love that. Dessert especially, I think, is something that a lot of people gravitate towards. So I think photographing it and then hopefully eating it after is a great you know, activity right now.
For sure. For sure.
Well, thank you again, Darina. This was really great. And thanks everybody for your questions. Just a few more little kind of housekeeping things at the end here. Obviously, you know, we only saw a really small amount of Darina's portfolio. So feel free to check out the rest of her work on her photo shelter site. So that's darinakopcok.com. And she also has a really great blog, which you can get to from her website. But if you want to go there directly, that is just gastrostoria.com. And there's some really, really great tips on there, you know, stories, obviously more image examples, and, you know, certainly a lot more to learn from her.